There are moments in life when time doesn't just slow. It stretches, forcing you to absorb every single second as if the universe itself has decided you need to pay attention. This was one of those moments. Sabrina stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the strap of her red dress. Her reflection smirked back at her, a silent companion to her confidence. She barely acknowledged me as she reached for her purse, her words slipping out so casually that they might have been mistaken for an afterthought, except they weren't. "I'm heading out on a date. Try not to get too jealous." For a fleeting second, I convinced myself I had misheard. Maybe it was a joke, some strange attempt at humor. But then I noticed the way she shifted her weight, how deliberately she avoided my eyes. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. My mouth went dry. My hands gripped the kitchen counter, knuckles whitening as my mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. There had to be an explanation, something logical that made this less absurd. "Excuse me?" The words came out steadier than I expected. Sabrina sighed, as if she were already exhausted by the conversation before it had even begun. "You heard me," she said, flipping her hair over her shoulder with practiced ease. "I have plans tonight with someone else." It wasn't just the words. It was the way she delivered them, effortlessly, without hesitation, as if this was nothing out of the ordinary. She stood before me in the dress I had bought for her, announcing her plans as though she had every right to. A date. The word hit like a punch to the stomach, knocking the air from my lungs. I should have reacted, should have shouted, demanded an explanation, done something. But instead, I just stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, realizing with startling clarity that I had never truly known her at all. I forced myself to breathe, to keep my voice level. "And you expect me to just accept this?" She smiled. Once, that smirk that used to be playful, the one I had once found so charming. Now it felt like a weapon. "I expect you to be mature about it," she said, as if explaining something simple. "We've been together for years, haven't we? Marriage gets routine. I just want to explore other possibilities." A hollow laugh escaped me, devoid of humor. My pulse pounded in my ears, yet outwardly, I remained composed. Too composed. "So, let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You're just openly seeing someone else now? No conversation, no warning, nothing?" She shrugged, completely unbothered, as if she were discussing something as trivial as returning an unwanted item to a store. "I figured you'd find out eventually," she said. "Why hide it? It's not like I'm leaving you." Something inside me shifted. Until now, I had been teetering on the edge of denial, searching for any reason to believe this was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. Sabrina wasn't sorry. She wasn't even hesitant. She had already made her decision. Now it was my turn to make mine. I watched as she adjusted her dress in the mirror, completely at ease, as though she hadn't just shattered the foundation of our marriage with nothing more than a smirk and a few thoughtless words. A date. She was going on a date. With someone else. My heartbeat was unnervingly steady. My mind, sharper than it should have been in a moment like this. A part of me expected the anger to come rushing in, to erupt, to shake the walls, to demand retribution. But it didn't. Not yet. Instead, I felt awake. For years, I had drifted through life, secure in the belief that I had everything figured out. I wasn't the kind of man who checked his wife's phone or questioned her every move. I trusted her. I had never been given a reason not to. Until now. Sabrina sighed again, her impatience growing as she shifted her purse to the other shoulder. "What?" she asked, her tone edged with annoyance. "You're acting weird." Weird? I almost laughed. Maybe I actually did. A hollow, lifeless sound. "How long?" I asked instead, my voice eerily even. She blinked. "How long what?" I leveled my gaze at her. "How long have you been doing this behind my back?" She rolled her eyes, exasperated, as if I were making a big deal out of nothing. "Don't be like that," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's not a big deal. Not a big deal." The phrase echoed in my mind, bouncing around, refusing to settle. I exhaled slowly, gripping the back of the chair in front of me. Not a big deal, I repeated, tilting my head slightly. You walking out that door, meeting another man, letting him touch you the way I do. That's not a big deal? For the first time, she hesitated. It was barely a flicker, just a brief parting of her lips, as if she were about to speak. But then, just as quickly, she stopped. And in that hesitation I saw it. Buried beneath all the arrogance, hidden behind that practiced indifference, there was something else. Guilt. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. She rolled her shoulders back, a familiar air of confidence settling over her. Her expression was composed, her tone smooth and unwavering as she spoke. I never said it wasn't important, she stated, her voice controlled. I'm just saying this is life. People grow. Relationships shift. And honestly, you should appreciate that I'm being upfront about it. Appreciate it? The sheer arrogance of her words made my jaw clench. I studied her carefully, noting the way she looked at me, not as an equal, but as someone she had already moved beyond. It was as if this moment, and everything we had built together, had already been discarded in her mind. And that's when it hit me. She had been preparing for this. Maybe not for this exact conversation, but for the moment itself. The moment when she would finally stop pretending, finally voice the truth, finally make it real. I stepped forward, deliberately slow. She didn't flinch, didn't avert her gaze. You are not the woman I married, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Her lips curled into a smirk, as if she had been waiting for me to say those words. Of course not, she replied, her tone light, almost casual. People change. I've changed. Maybe it's time you did too. She spoke to me like I was a stranger, like I was the unreasonable one in all of this. I exhaled slowly through my nose, forcing myself to stay composed. And what exactly do you expect me to do with this information, Sabrina? She raised a brow, as if the answer should have been obvious. I expect you to accept it. She took another step toward the door, glancing at her watch as if checking the time. Like this was just another scheduled event in her day. Like I was just another obligation to be dealt with before moving on to something more interesting. She had already made her decision. And now, so had I. I straightened, my posture stiffening, my hands loosening from their clenched position. Go, I said simply. For the first time, she looked taken aback. Her head tilted slightly, her lips parting in surprise. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. You're okay with this? I smiled. Not the kind of smile she was used to. No, I admitted, my voice calm. But you already made your choice. Now it's my turn. Sabrina hesitated, her fingers twitching at her side. And for the first time that evening, I saw something new in her, uncertainty. Good. Without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. I didn't move, didn't lash out, didn't break anything. I just stood there, my mind racing faster than ever. She believed she was in control of this situation, but she had no idea what was coming next. And by the time I was finished, she wouldn't be smirking anymore. The silence stretched on long after the door clicked shut. But this wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the kind that seeps into your bones, turning a place you once loved into something unrecognizable, something empty. Sabrina had walked out as if she hadn't just torn our marriage apart with a smirk and a few careless words. I'm off on a date. Try not to be too jealous. The sentence echoed in my mind, looping over and over like a broken record. And with each repetition, the weight in my chest grew heavier. I let my gaze drift around the house, the space we had built together. The framed photos hanging on the walls. The faint trace of her perfume still clinging to the air. The half-empty coffee mug she had left on the counter that morning. Everything looked the same, and yet, none of it felt familiar anymore. Slowly, I sank into one of the dining chairs, pressing my fingertips to my temples. My thoughts spun wildly. How long had she been planning this? How long had I been living in blissful ignorance, thinking we were just another married couple working through the usual ups and downs? Had she been seeing this other man for weeks? Months? Years? I wanted to be angry, Wanted to feel the kind of rage that would make me punch a hole in the wall, shatter something, scream until my voice gave out. But I didn't feel any of that. What I felt was clarity. She had made her decision. And now, for the first time in a long while, I had a choice too. A different kind of response. Most men in my situation would have confronted their wife immediately. Demanded answers. Demanded the truth. Maybe even begged for some sort of explanation. But I wasn't going to do that. Sabrina wanted me to react. She wanted a scene. She wanted to see me unravel. To confirm in her mind that I was nothing more than the pitiful, predictable husband she had already dismissed. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I took a slow breath and reached for my phone. I wasn't calling her. That would have been too easy. No, I was calling someone else. Someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. When the line picked up, I spoke first. "Hey, it's me." There was a pause. Then, a familiar voice. "Nate." I hadn't spoken to my brother in over a year. Not because of some dramatic falling out, but because life had simply taken us in different directions. He had moved out of state, built his own world, while I had sunk deeper and deeper into the routine of marriage, of work, of responsibility. "I need a favor," I said, getting straight to the point. Another pause. Then his voice came through. "What kind of favor?" I hesitated, tightening. I just needed to step away for a while. As I let out a long breath, Nate's voice came through the phone. "You okay?" Was I? Honestly, I wasn't sure. But this wasn't the kind of conversation I could have over the phone. "Not really," I admitted. "But I will be." A brief silence stretched between us before he finally said, "Come on over." Without another word, I hung up, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. I didn't even bother locking it behind me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't certain if I'd be coming back. The drive to Nate's place took longer than I remembered, leaving me alone with my thoughts for too much time. Sabrina had never been the type to settle for a simple life. She always craved more. More excitement. More adventure. More attention. Maybe I had been blind to it, or maybe I had just convinced myself that I was enough for her. Clearly, I wasn't. By the time I pulled into Nate's driveway, my mind was made up. I wasn't going to chase after her. I wasn't going to fight for a woman who had mentally checked out of our marriage long before she physically walked out the door tonight. Instead, I was going to do the one thing she never saw coming. I was going to let her go. And deep down, I had a feeling that, in the end, she would regret it far more than I ever would. Sitting in my car for a while, I stared out into the quiet street. The hum of the engine was the only sound around me. It felt surreal. This wasn't where I was supposed to be tonight. I should have been at home, maybe watching a late-night show with Sabrina or lying in bed while she absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone. But that life was gone now. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, inhaling deeply. A part of me considered turning back, driving home, and pretending none of this had happened. But I knew better. Sabrina had made sure of that. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about control. The smirk she had given me, the casual way she had brushed me aside, the confidence in her step as she left. She wanted me to feel powerless. She wanted me to believe that I had no say in my own marriage. But she was wrong. I wasn't some lost, desperate man waiting for her to come home. I wasn't going to fall apart over the choices she had made. If she thought she had control over how this story would unfold, she was sorely mistaken. A brother's perspective. Finally, I stepped out of the car and knocked twice on Nate's door. It swung open almost immediately, and there he was, standing in sweatpants and a hoodie, staring at me like I had just materialized from another world. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, stepping aside to let me in. I walked in, taking in the familiar surroundings. It had been over a year since I last set foot in his house, yet nothing had changed. The same worn leather couch. The same stack of books on the coffee table. The familiar scent of coffee lingering in the air. Nate shut the door and crossed his arms, studying me. "All right," he said, his tone firm. "What's going on?" I let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through my hair. "Sabrina's been cheating on me." Saying it out loud felt strange, as if the words didn't belong to me, as if they were from someone else's life. Nate's expression darkened. Are you sure? I let out a humorless scoff. She told me herself. His eyes narrowed. She actually told you? Oh, not in a remorseful kind of way, I said bitterly. More like she wanted to rub it in. She stood right in front of me, put on a dress, and told me she was going on a date. Just like that. No shame. No second thoughts. Nate let out a slow whistle. Wow, that's something. Yeah. I exhaled sharply, sinking onto the couch. And that's where I'm at right now. For a moment he didn't respond. He just sat across from me, tapping his fingers against his knee, deep in thought. Then, after a long pause, he finally asked, "So what now?" I had been waiting for that question. Betrayal had a way of knocking the air out of you at first, leaving you hollow, directionless. But once the initial shock faded, you were left with a choice. Either remain the victim or take back control. I refused to be the victim. Leaning forward, I met Nate's gaze. I'm not chasing her, I said firmly. I'm not fighting for her. I'm not begging her to stay. I'm just done. Nate raised an eyebrow. Just like that. I shrugged. What's the alternative? Sit around and wait for her to come home, acting like nothing happened? Try to win her back while she's off entertaining someone else. He nodded slowly. You're right. She doesn't deserve that. No, she doesn't, I agreed. And yet, despite everything, a heavy weight still settled over me. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the ease with which she had done it. She hadn't even tried to hide it. She had looked me in the eye, daring me to react. That wasn't just infidelity. That was cruelty. And cruelty like that didn't come out of nowhere. She's been planning this? I said aloud, the realization settling over me like a cold wave. Nate frowned. What do you mean? I dragged a hand down my face, the pieces clicking into place. She didn't just wake up today and decide to do this. She's been distancing herself for months. Working late, making excuses, treating me like an afterthought. This wasn't some impulsive mistake. It was calculated. That realization should have made me feel worse. Strangely enough, it didn't hurt. Instead, it fueled a fire inside me, an anger that simmered beneath the surface. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't just a man betrayed by his wife. No, I was someone whose spouse had meticulously plotted his downfall for months, all while expecting him to sit back and accept it without resistance. Then came the unexpected message. Just as I was about to speak, my phone vibrated. A sense of unease twisted in my gut when I glanced at the screen. Sabrina. Nate leaned in, curious. Are you going to answer that? For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, hesitating. Then, finally, I swiped to read the message. Hey, don't wait up. I might be late. A short, humorless laugh escaped me, echoing through the quiet room. Even now, she still believed she was in control. Still assumed I was sitting at home, waiting like a fool for her return. Nate peered at my screen, shaking his head. Wow, she's really just going all in with this. Huh. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, my expression unreadable. Yeah, I said, but so am I. Because what Sabrina didn't realize was that by the time she walked back through that door, she wouldn't be stepping into the same life she had left behind. She had made her choices, now it was time for me to make mine. I didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't anger, sorrow, or heartbreak that kept me awake. Those emotions had burned away long ago, leaving something far colder and more calculated in their place. I was thinking, strategizing. As the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds in Nate's guest room, I had already mapped out my next steps. Steps that would unravel Sabrina's carefully orchestrated plans and expose them for what they truly were. Amateurish. She believed she had control. She thought she understood me, that I was the devoted husband who would sit idly by, waiting for her return, maybe even begging for an explanation. But for the first time in our marriage, the power had shifted. I was the one pulling the strings now. That morning, the first thing I did was call a lawyer. But not just any lawyer, I wanted the best. Nate had connections, and within an hour, I was seated across from a man who exuded confidence. the kind of person who didn't just win cases but dominated them. His name was Damian Langston, and his presence alone was enough to make even the most ruthless hesitate. Damian flipped through the folder of documents I had brought, his sharp gaze scanning the contents. Finally, he spoke. "So, your wife is having an affair and she assumes you're just going to— What? Sit around and take it? Seems like it," I replied evenly. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. People like her always think they're untouchable. Until they're not. I already liked him. I laid everything out for him. The smirk on Sabrina's face when she told me she had a date. The emotional distance that had been growing for months. Her arrogance. Her complete lack of remorse. Damian listened carefully, nodding occasionally as he processed every detail. After a moment of silence, he leaned back in his chair. "This works in your favor," he said. "You haven't confronted her yet, which means she still thinks she has the upper hand. That's good. Let her keep believing that. The less she suspects, the smoother this will go." I exhaled, feeling tension leave my body for the first time in days. This was happening. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was taking action. That evening, I returned home. I had expected the house to feel unfamiliar after everything that had transpired. But to my surprise, it didn't. Felt exactly the same. Because in the end, it wasn't the home that had changed. It was her. Stepping inside, I closed the door behind me. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air. A ghostly reminder of the moment she had stood in this very space, smiling as she told me she was leaving to be with someone else. I moved through the house, taking in the details, the framed pictures on the walls, the neatly arranged bookshelves, the throw blanket draped over the couch. On the surface, everything seemed intact. But beneath it all, the foundation was already crumbling. Then I heard it, the sound of a key turning in the lock. She stepped inside, casually tossing her purse onto the counter, as if she hadn't just spent the night with another man. But when her eyes landed on me, she stopped in her tracks. "Oh," she said, clearly caught off guard. "You're home." She wasn't expecting to see me. That much was obvious. I leaned casually against the kitchen island, offering her a relaxed smile. "Where else would I be?" She studied me carefully, as if trying to read my mood. Was I angry? About to break down? Pleading for an explanation? I did none of those things. Instead, I tilted my head slightly. "So, how was your date?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Hesitation, perhaps. But she recovered quickly, forcing a sweet smile. "It was great. Thanks for asking." I nodded, pretending to care. Then, with a small gesture, I directed her attention toward the dining table. Her eyes followed my movement, and the second she spotted the stack of documents waiting for her, the smirk vanished. "What's this?" she asked, her voice slower, more careful now. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted her to sit in that moment, to feel the walls closing in around her. Then, finally, I spoke. "Divorce papers," I said smoothly. "Figured I'd save you the trouble." Her lips parted slightly, caught completely off guard. This wasn't what she had expected. She had braced for an argument, anticipated drama, prepared herself for a desperate plea. What she hadn't expected was for me to be the one calling the shots. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice quieter now. I met her gaze, unwavering. Completely. She released a breathless laugh, though there was no amusement in it. "So, that's it? You're just done?" I pretended to consider it for a moment before offering a small smile. "Yep." For the first time since this whole situation began, I saw something new in her eyes. Panic. She had been so certain that I would fight for her, that I would plead for her to stay, that I would be too devastated to walk away. She had misjudged me. And now, as realization set in, it was clear that she understood her mistake. But it no longer mattered. Without another word, I turned and made my way toward the stairs, leaving her frozen in stunned silence. She simply wasn't worth another second of my time. As I walked past, I could feel Sabrina's gaze following me, heavy and intense. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, nearly suffocating in its weight. Like the calm before a brewing storm. I heard the slight hitch in her breathing, the unsteady exhale, small signs betraying the fact that she was not as untouchable as she had once believed. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Each step I took echoed through the quiet house, our house, at least for now. Reaching the bedroom, I closed the door behind me and locked it, not out of fear, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of another conversation. She had made her stance clear the moment she smirked and casually informed me that she was going on a date. Everything that came after? Irrelevant. I sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling deeply. The day had drained me in ways I hadn't anticipated, but at the same time, a sense of liberation settled over me. The decision had been made and she knew it. That alone gave me an advantage she had never seen coming. The faint sounds of movement downstairs told me she hadn't stormed out yet. She was still there, likely lingering as she tried to find a way to twist the situation to her benefit. Sabrina was good at that, reframing reality, making herself appear to be the victim, turning situations into something they weren't. But this time she had no leverage. Pulling out my phone, I scrolled through my messages until I found Damien's name. Our earlier conversation lit up the screen. Make sure she doesn't suspect anything until everything is finalized. I smirked. She hadn't suspected a thing. A knock on the door broke the silence. I ignored it. Another knock followed, more insistent this time. Still, I remained motionless. Finally, her voice came through. Nathan. I closed my eyes briefly. She only used my full name when she wanted something. What? My tone was flat, devoid of any emotion. There was a pause. Then, she asked, "Can we talk?" A quiet breath escaped me as I shook my head, even though she couldn't see. Now she wanted to talk? I had given her countless chances before, to communicate, to be honest about what she wanted, to tell me if something was wrong. But instead, she had chosen to humiliate me, to treat me as an afterthought in my own marriage. And now that I wasn't groveling at her feet, she suddenly wanted a conversation. Typical. I got up, unlocked the door, but didn't open it. If she wanted to talk, it would be on my terms. The moment the door cracked, she pushed her way inside. The confidence she had carried earlier was gone, replaced by something else, uncertainty. Good. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly as if trying to regain control. So, you're just ending things? I met her gaze, unwavering. Yeah. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Come on, Nathan. This is ridiculous. I almost laughed. Ridiculous? She had strutted out of our house like royalty heading to a grand celebration, making a spectacle of her betrayal as if it were meaningless. And now she had the audacity to call this ridiculous? I crossed my arms. What exactly do you think is ridiculous? The fact that I'm not begging you to stay? That I'm not chasing after you for your attention? Because if that's what you expected, you miscalculated badly. Her lips parted slightly, thrown off balance. For the first time, she seemed lost for words. I thought we had an understanding, she muttered after a pause, her voice softer now. I raised an eyebrow. An understanding? She hesitated before speaking again. Marriage isn't so black and white, Nathan. It's not some perfect fairy tale where two people stay completely devoted to each other forever. People change. Situations evolve. And I thought. She exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into her voice. I thought you'd at least be open-minded. Open-minded? I repeated, shaking my head with a quiet laugh. Let me get this straight. You think a real marriage means I should sit back while you go off having your fun? That I should accept you dating other people while I stay home like some loyal pet? She frowned. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. For a fleeting second, frustration flickered across her face, and the polished facade she usually wore began to crack. You're making this harder than it needs to be, she muttered. I took a step closer, lowering my voice.
No, Sabrina.
You made this harder the moment you decided I wasn't worth the truth. Her jaw tightened. So what now? We just throw away everything we built. I tilted my head slightly. You already did. She flinched. Her reaction was small, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Letting out a slow breath, I finally felt the exhaustion seep into my bones. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing more I could offer her. The divorce is happening, I stated, my voice devoid of emotion. If you want to act surprised, be my guest. But don't stand there pretending this isn't what you chose. A heavy silence stretched between us before she finally turned on her heel and left the room. This time, I didn't bother watching her go. I didn't care anymore. For the first time in years, I was done fighting for something that had been lost long ago. The moment Sabrina walked out, the weight of everything finally settled over me. But it wasn't sorrow. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even regret. It was freedom. Running a hand down my face, I exhaled slowly, taking in the quiet that now filled the house. The only sounds were distant. The faint clinking of glass, the soft shuffle of her steps against the hardwood floor, subtle signs of a woman struggling to process the unthinkable. In her mind, I was supposed to fight for her. She had been so certain that I would cling to her, desperate to salvage what was left of our marriage. She never once considered the possibility that I had already let go. I moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. Outside, the street looked just as it always did, calm, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights, shadows stretching across the pavement. It was almost unsettling how normal everything appeared when my entire world had just shifted. Then I heard her voice. At first, it was quiet, nearly indistinct. I turned my head slightly, realizing she was on the phone. I wasn't planning to listen. I had spent enough time caring about what she had to say. But something in her tone made me hesitate. It wasn't the usual confident, self-assured voice she had used with me earlier. Gone was the arrogance she carried like armor. No, this voice was unsteady. Curious, I moved closer to the bedroom door, making sure my steps were silent as I cracked it open just enough to hear. "I don't know," she whispered sharply, frustration evident in her voice. "He's not reacting the way I thought he would." I stilled, my grip tightening around the doorknob as a cold sensation curled in my stomach. Who was she talking to? And why did she sound so concerned? She exhaled harshly. "No, of course, I didn't expect him to be happy about it. But I thought he'd put up a fight. He just agreed. It's like he doesn't even care." A pause. Then, softer, almost uncertain, she muttered, "What if I miscalculated?" I nearly laughed. Miscalculated? That was probably the most insightful thing she had said all night. Leaning against the doorway, I crossed my arms, letting her conversation unfold. A long silence followed before she let out a sharp breath. "No, he doesn't know. Why would I tell him? That would ruin everything." Another pause. Then her next words sent a slow, creeping fire through my veins. "I'll handle it. Just stick to the plan." The plan. Of course, there was a plan. I should have seen it sooner. Sabrina was never the type to act on impulse without a safety net in place. This wasn't just a reckless decision. It was calculated, premeditated, and I wasn't supposed to react like this. I was supposed to beg, to plead, to be so emotionally wrecked that I wouldn't see the trap she had set. Too bad for her. I wasn't the man she thought I was. Taking a quiet step back, I exhaled slowly, my pulse steady, my mind sharper than it had been in years. This wasn't about betrayal anymore. This was a game, and she believed she was the only one playing. I turned away, walking back to the bed and picking up my phone. If she had a plan, then it was time I made one of my own, one she would never see coming. For the past few days, I had been watching her, fitting together the puzzle she never thought I'd piece together. She had set this up long before that night, long before she stood in front of me, smirking about her so-called date. And the worst part? She had been so certain of herself, so confident that I would react exactly as she wanted. But now, she was starting to panic. At first, it was the little things I noticed, the way she hovered near her phone, constantly checking it. The way she would start to speak, only to hesitate and hold back, something that was unlike her. The way she lingered in the house more, as if waiting for me to explode, to give her the dramatic confrontation she had been counting on. But I gave her nothing, and that terrified her. Because I wasn't acting like a devastated husband. I wasn't yelling, wasn't pleading, wasn't lashing out. I was calm. And people like Sabrina? They don't know what to do with calm. I let her sit with that uncertainty for 3 days. Then, on the 4th day, I set my final move into motion. I waited until she was out of the house before making a few calls. I met with Damien once more, finalizing the last details of the divorce. One that, thanks to my lawyer's expertise, ensured that Sabrina walked away with absolutely nothing in her favor. I had secured everything: the house, the assets, and an airtight file of evidence proving her betrayal. There was no way for her to fight back. By the time I was finished, every possible escape route had been sealed shut. She had unknowingly walked straight into her own downfall. That evening I sat at the kitchen table, waiting. My keys rested on the counter, beside a lone glass of whiskey. The front door creaked open, and Sabrina stepped inside. She froze the moment she saw me. There it was again, hesitation. The nervous flicker in her eyes told me she sensed something was wrong. Good. I gestured toward the chair across from me, silently instructing her to sit. Her jaw clenched, but after a brief moment of defiance, she complied. As I watched her, I noted the slight tension in her posture, the restless movement of her fingers against the table's surface. Without a word, I pushed a folder toward her. She eyed it warily. "What is this?" "Open it." She hesitated, then reached forward, flipping the folder open. The instant her gaze landed on the contents, she went completely still. "You've been planning this?" I remarked, my tone almost casual as I leaned back in my chair. I figured it was only fair that I had a plan of my own. Her throat moved as she swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the paper. "Mrs. E. Divorce papers," I interrupted smoothly. "Finalized." I met her gaze with unwavering certainty. And since I was the one betrayed, I made sure they worked in my favor. For the first time, I saw something in her expression that wasn't anger or sadness. Fear. True, unfiltered fear. She had never considered the possibility of losing. She had never imagined that I would be the one holding the upper hand. She started, but I raised a hand to silence her. "Don't," I said firmly. "I don't care what excuse you have. I don't care what your reasoning was. I don't even care who he is." I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make sure my words hit their mark. "The only thing that matters to me is that you leave my house." Her breath hitched slightly. "Nathan, this was your choice," I reminded her. "You wanted freedom? Here it is. You wanted to be with other people? Congratulations. You can do that somewhere else." Her eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if she wanted to argue. But instead, she blinked rapidly, her fingers curling into fists. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I responded coldly. "You assumed I was weak, that I would chase after you, beg for answers, fight to keep you. You thought this would break me." I tilted my head slightly. "But you miscalculated." Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, she let out a breathy, hollow laugh. It wasn't amusement. It was the bitter sound of someone who had just lost everything. She shook her head slowly. "I guess I did." I stood, grabbing my keys without another word. "Pack your things. You're leaving tonight." She didn't protest.
No tears, no pleading.
Just a quiet nod as she looked down at the papers again, as if struggling to grasp how she had ended up here. She had been so certain she was in control, so sure that she held all the power. But in the end, she had outplayed herself. And me? I walked out that door free.